quick flashcards of the books of the Bible in the Old and New Testament. You have to quickly guess if the book of the Bible we give you is in the Old Testament or New Testament. Have fun learning it. It's going to go fast. Let's get started. Judges. Old Testament. Philemon. New Testament. Amos. Old Testament. Esther. Old Testament. Philippians. New Testament. Deuteronomy. Old Testament. John. New Testament. Zechariah. Old Testament. Galatians. New Testament. Ezra. Old Testament. Chronicles. Old Testament. Isaiah. Old Testament. Obadiah. Old Testament. Romans. New Testament. Malachi. Old Testament. Did you know that the longest book in the Old Testament is Psalms with 150 chapters, and the shortest book in the Old Testament is Obadiah with 21 verses? Hebrews. New Testament. Jonah. Old Testament. Lamentations. Old Testament. Leviticus. Old Testament. Revelation. New Testament. Proverbs. Old Testament. Titus. New Testament. Genesis. Old Testament. Ruth. Old Testament. James. New Testament. Exodus. Old Testament. Jude. New Testament. Nehemiah. Old Testament. Daniel. Old Testament. Luke. New Testament. And did you know that the longest book in the New Testament is actually the book of Luke? Even though it's only 24 chapters, it has the most verses, and the shortest book is 3rd John. It may have more verses than 2nd John, but less words. Timothy. New Testament. Joel. Old Testament. Joshua. Old Testament. Job. Old Testament. Jeremiah. Old Testament. John. New Testament. Numbers. Old Testament. Colossians. New Testament. Ezekiel. Old Testament. Zephaniah. Old Testament. Hosea. Old Testament. Acts. New Testament. Nahum. Old Testament. Haggai. Old Testament. Ecclesiastes. Old Testament. When you hit that like and subscribe button, you keep biblical content growing on YouTube. Habakkuk. Old Testament. Samuel. Old Testament. Song of Songs. Old Testament. Mark. New Testament. Micah. Old Testament. Matthew. New Testament. Corinthians. New Testament. Kings. Old Testament. Ephesians. New Testament. Psalms. Old Testament. Thessalonians. New Testament. Peter. New Testament. If you need a way to memorize the books of the Bible, check out this video. The link is in the description. And make sure to check out our other Bible games in our Bible Games playlist. The link is in the description. And keep yourself growing from milk to manna and get solid in God's Word.